must be a kind of blind love. I can't see anyone but you.
Take a big sip. Hello, my name is Cassie, and here I'll talk about media that I find interesting. Now, on this winter afternoon, my intention is to talk about the portrayal of Snicket in particular, and authorities in general, in the world of Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. To do this, I'll be focusing mostly on the Netflix show, but for the sake of context, I think it'll be necessary to touch first, as concisely as possible, on the other mediums in which the series was adapted. I'll make use of examples of all 3 instances of the work, so be warned that there are going to be spoilers. Also, a quick side note, I will try my best not to stray from the issue at hand and talk about other aspects of the Netflix show that I think are either tasteless or at best, or outright offensive at worst. I am not interested in discussing bad CGI or bad performances or plot holes or wonky dialogue or general contrived coincidences, all of which are in my eyes not the worst thing a children's show can have or can be. I'm not here to review the show, nor to tell you whether or not you should watch it. All that I will say are my interpretations, theories and opinions, and you don't have to share them nor agree with them. All I ask, since you're already here, is to listen. When one reads the first book in A Series of Unfortunate Events, The Bad Beginning, its narrator Lemony Snicket doesn't immediately position himself as part of a story, yet he undoubtedly talks directly to the reader. He is not hidden behind the text, he is present through his personal opinions and in the descriptions of his own life. He is referring as you, the dear reader, in the back of the books, signing as to legitimize his identity in the vague biography, in his letters to the editor, where he anticipates future misadventures, and of course his personal posthumous messages that open every book dedicated to his dearly beloved, dearly departed Beatrice. All this evidence of his existence is presented in favor of realism, of convincing the reader that yes, there is a real-life person called Lemony Snicket, and that the series of books one reads is, in fact, all written by him. I know I believed he was real as a child, but it's in the following books that he becomes more than a peculiar narrator. It's a gradual change. It's most evident in the appearance of his brother Jack Snicket in the 7th book, The Vile Village, that the reader is actually going to think, well, so is really Lemony Snicket, because of his brother, a character inside this world? Is Lemony Snicket real? And therefore, is his brother real? Are the Baudelaire children real? And so the reader realizes that Lemony Snicket is truly real in the universe of the story. The line between the narrative universe and the real universe are blurred. As one begins to question the reality of a man named Lemony Snicket and realizes the implications of his own narrative existence, how his own life may be related to that of the Baudelaire children. And so, as Snicket becomes more of a defined character in the series, he begins to share more about himself and about his own relation with other characters, about his fear of Count Olaf, about his admiration for the other members of BFD, the secret organization they all have worked for since they were children, in which they were trained and raised, and about his association with his siblings, Kit and Jack Snicket, who both appear ostensibly as possible allies to the Baudelaires, only to fail, like all other adults, in their attempts to help them. So Lemony Snicket, the narrator of A Series of Unfortunate Events, switches constantly between the third person omniscient, knowing how the characters felt and what they thought, and the first person, where Snicket is a distinct character who has experienced his own share of loss and grief, and who positions himself as a sort of a reporter or a detective investigator of sorts working on the Baudelaire case. This sort of contradiction, a character who is both omniscient and human, who knows everything but exists along a cast of inconsistently clueless characters, defines part of what makes Snicket himself. He is also emotional but completely serious. He is mysterious and private, but prone to share small glimpses of his most personal moments and relationships. And Snicket's use of reverse psychology is part of the appeal of the book series, after all, and of the narration style's charm. his consistent refusal of "look away, don't read these books, don't read this because your life is going to be more miserable because of it." If you're a child, how can you resist when a narrator tells you this is an awful story and you better look away? What has happened that has caused so much grief?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Despite all the fandom dislike changes made in the adaptation from book to movie, it's important to acknowledge the fidelity in the movie's representation of Lemony Snicket. Since the movie did not follow Daniel Handler's scripts, and the understated mystery of BFD, just like it was in the first few books, remains an understated mystery, Snicket's involvement with this organization is kept implied, and while the movie is rarely subtle, its treatment of the character Snicket is quite subtle, staying very much in line with the early book's depiction of him. He is unreachable, distant, a detective that collects information about events that happen to people long gone, and someone who just recollects information and stays anonymous. And the plot loses little by not having him, really. As the narration style just barely seeps into the movie, it's overshadowed constantly by Olaf's bombastic portrayal and other fantastical stylistic choices. His participation in the narration, mostly, basically, in the movie, is almost just to keep that flavor of the books, that flavor that Lemony Snicket's or Daniel Handler's narration originally had. And it's basically that. Something that, at least to me, becomes apparent is that Jude Law's Snicket is somewhat younger, more, I want to say naive, but more innocent or less bitter after everything that has happened to him. This is not an adventurer as much as he is, like I said, a reporter, an investigator. Jude Law was, I'm guessing, cast for his vocal talent and his name recognition, which is hard to capitalize on, considering the whole deal behind the portrayal of this version of Lemony Snicket is that his face is obscured, just like in the books. This Snicket doesn't seem to really have any power at all in the narrative. As he features little in the story, he doesn't appear to have much of authority himself. He is our narrator, he conducts us through the story, but he doesn't affect the plot, and he doesn't teach us as much as Lemony in the book does. His little quirk of explaining what a word means, it's there in the movie, of course it is, because it's one of the characteristics of the narration style of the book, but it isn't as prevalent, and it isn't as important, maybe. He tells us a story, but by being absolutely detached from it, he is in his place and the children are in another. And the mystery of his character is hardly engaging when he is framed as so separated from the narrative he is telling. He's like a mysterious stranger in a train or plane ride that tells you a story about someone he heard about, someone he doesn't know, someone who knows someone he knows, and happened a long time ago in a faraway place. his own version of Once Upon a Time. He investigates, yes, the Baudelaire case, but we're never really expecting him to pop up inside the story. This happened long ago, and he has no say on what happened, on what he can change in it. And we accept this because, despite the elaborate joke with the stop-motion animated sequence at the beginning of the movie, the narrative of the movie as it is presented to us is demonstrably fairy tale-like. The children are like Hansel and Gretel in a way, escaping from monsters, trying to get off the woods, trying to find a place to rest. Jude Law's Snicket feels like just the chronicler, the in-between. He's barely a character at all. In the Netflix show, however, Snicket changes roles constantly. He's a reporter, an outlaw, an advisor, an author, an explorer, a tourist, a sad clown, a fashion icon, a newscaster, a researcher, a personality. He's not limited to telling us the Baudelaire story, but the story of his own relationship with the villainy, the nobility, and the circumstances that left him mourning the death of a loved one, in a direct comparison to the grief of the Baudelaire children. And apart from the role of narrator and character in the world of the series, Snicket stands as a definitive authority in the subject of the Baudelaire's lives. As readers and listeners and watchers, as children, either literally or figuratively, we don't often question our narrator. After all, he has the information we crave. So he takes the role of teacher and he educates us on emotions, science, vocabulary, and literature through the particular case of the Baudelaire children. One is always reminded of Snicket's presence. He doesn't take distance, he inserts himself in the frame and encourages us to follow along, even more so than the movie where Jude Law played a detached, shadowy Snicket in the silhouetted style of the book photos that accompany every biography. Patrick Warburton's Snicket is involved much more so. He is much less like the Snicket in the original first few books and more like the one that comes after Vile Village, the one that mentions his brothers, that mentions his organization, which now is present in every episode. It's almost a constant and is not subdued nor implied at all. It's first, it's on the it's front and center in the story. We get many mentions of him, we get flashbacks of him, and he's a larger, more participating character than he ever was in the previous incarnations. The Netflix show, as it attempts to fill the longer runtime of the episodes, feels the need to further develop these characters. Like Snicket's increased screen time was to be expected, of course, along with the development and characterization of Olaf and his troupe, the focus on the hijinks of neo-BFD agents, and the increasingly contrived presence of Poe and the further exaggeration of his incompetence. But while movie Snicket was definitely an author, locked up in his tower, writing away in his typewriter, completely separated from the action, Netflix Snicket isn't recognizable or as recognizable as an author. Of course we know he is. His signature is featured over the title of the show, and we are being told the story through him. He is our narrator. That's not something that can be questioned, really. And yet he isn't given that many of the images we associate with an author or a writer. He barely is seen doing any writing at all. Understandably, after all, since this is a different medium. But rather than a writer, he's an actor. He changes costumes, he travels through sets. He's introduced to us in the way a narrator may be introduced in a play rather than in a movie or a book or a TV show. He assumes roles, disguises, and explores the crime scene, so as to say, the places where the Baudelaire children either were, are, or maybe will be. And he invites us along to the investigation, of course, while warning us that coming along will be a very, very bad idea indeed. And he, like the book, is omniscient and omnipresent, but also, absurdly, part of the world he is explaining to us. And by having Snicket talk to us, eye to eye, he involves us in the story, unlike the book narration does, which I find really interesting. This is heightened by the existence of this particular teaser, one of the first that Netflix released as promotion for the Netflix show. Snicket is in a film set. He is still in character, of course. He is Lemony Snicket, not Patrick Warburton. But he recognizes that this place is a representation of a place, not a real thing. It's a place where the misadventures of the Baudelaire children will be represented for our entertainment. The movie never dared to do something like this, and there's a safety to the narration in the books that doesn't exist in the show. When Olaf looks at the camera, there's no equivalent of that in the written page. Snicket stops time, moves forward, and is always in control of the narration of the Baudelaire story. He is Hitchcock presenting us the Bates Motel, or better yet, he is Rod Serling, showing us the horrors of possible pasts and futures. But Snicket is not confrontational. He talks to us with the patience of a parent or a teacher. The complicit arrangement of accepting the Baudelaire misadventures as a spectacle is never as prominent as in that first teaser, but it's there still. Snicket assumes that we are there because we didn't heed his warnings, and because we do truly want to suffer what the Baudelaires went through, and we want to know what happened to them. In the manner of other children's entertainment, stories about children withstanding the hardships of the apathetic adult world is narrated by adults sympathetic to their plight. So my thesis is, Snicket's further participation in the plot also serves to underline a certain aspect. The show isn't seen through the eyes of the children, as some reviewers have said. The Baudelaires seldom get a chance to control the narratives, their stories. Snicket does. Snicket controls the narrative in a way. It's Snicket, and worse, it's Olaf too, who speaks to the audience. Olaf and Snicket present themselves as foils, the black sheep of BFD versus the hero of the organization. They speak of noble ideals and of vile acts, but despite the hero status given to the Snickets and the firefighting side of the schism, Snicket won't save the Baudelaires. He can't, because nobody seems able to save them, because nobody actually listens to them, because nobody can get over their own issues, not even our narrator, especially our narrator. Despite our narrators defining words for us in a true didactic form, much like in the books, Snicket, while often veering into the paternalistic at times, doesn't become overbearingly condescending. The humor is often word-based, very dark, and it doesn't really hold back any punches. Snicket warned us that awful things were to come, and he doesn't shield us from those things. Though he claims he wants to, but can't. He really can't. While the humor in the book and in the movie came mostly from the silliness and absurdity of the world the children encounter after the death of their parents, the show also had humor derived from a certain embarrassment, the so-called cringe humor, so to say, that comes from fear, from anxiety. One laughs at how ridiculous the whole thing is, at how ridiculously unaware the adults are, and at the same time one fears that this time their ignorance will be costly, as it often ends up to be. And in a way, that makes us complicit not with Snicket, but with Olaf. An authority figure that while having no direct control on the children beyond the first book, is more than often in control of the situation, of his troop, of his environment, of the people that have to and should aid the children. He assumes the identities of authorities in any field, whether that field is herpetology, medicine, physical education, law, or a very large lake. Olaf's actual acting talent, as awful it may seem to us and to the children, doesn't need to be great, only convincing to other people who seek authorities to rely on. That's basically the defining trait of Mr. Poe, who, despite having a high position in the bank, is consistently incompetent and actively useless. Authority in the world of A Series of Unfortunate Events is similarly an incompetent, insufficient, or actively harmful entity which the Baudelaire children can find no real comfort in. They are forced, as in many children's stories, to become self-sufficient and learn not to rely on outside help of any sort. But what does that look like in a world not meant to be fantasy but satire? If the Baudelaires represent hope in the future in the most optimistic, selfless way, Snicket represents, much like Olaf, something so bitter, even more so than the fact that children have to suffer so much and find ways to still connect with others, to remain kind and morally upright. Snicket represents a dusty past of triumphs that can no longer serve a purpose, that despite the best of intentions, they cannot protect the children. Being a good person, like some of the tutors, doesn't necessarily make you helpful or heroic. We know we can't completely trust adults in this world. They are all bound to disappoint and betray the children as they become caught up in their own problems, their own inadequacies, their own traumas, their own agendas through which they want to subject them. BFD is an embodiment of all that mystery and ambiguity, of all the unmitigated cruelty that wants to take advantage of the neglected children, and also of the well-meaning incompetence of those who become complicit in the neglect. And if none of the tutors are to be trusted or relied on, why should we trust Snicket? There were two popular theories among the fandom regarding Snicket's true identity: that he was a grown-up Klaus Baudelaire writing under a pseudonym, giving a reason for this grown man's obsessive dedication to document the lives of these children, and that Snicket was the tutor who would ultimately save and protect the children. Both are fascinating theories on their own right, but both miss what I think is the point. Snicket is yet another shady adult in a shady organization. He knows about the children and spies on them like Olaf does, yet one would argue with more benign intentions. But in the end, as with all the other tutors, the intentions don't really matter. What really matters are his actions. And as he mostly keeps away from the children throughout his narration, making his big moment, the implied in the book, but series canonically appearance as a taxi driver in the penultimate peril, literally almost at the end of their journey, after they had gone through horrors, unimaginable trauma, abuse, and abandonment. The show, having not only all the books already written and published, a movie to compare itself to, but also the direct contribution of the author, is still remarkably different from the books. The timelines are changed drastically, the anachronisms are more obvious, new characters are introduced, some are changed entirely, and the focus is often changed due to needs in the adaptation, but it's also somehow even more chaotic than the already absurd and silly books. As the literary narration played around with form and with what one could and could not do within the format of a children's book, the show also managed this not only in form but also in content, by use of the direct narration, the fourth wall breaking, the definition, the violent mood shifts, the adult subject matter, the brutality, and the emotionality. As absurd as this world is, the children, the most human characters in the show, aren't impervious to its cruelty. They aren't all the time perky and happy and feisty and ready to take whatever life gives them. They are allowed to be human, to grieve. to be sad, to be bitter and angry. They feel every painful loss, every terrifying threat, and every hopeless situation. They are the heart of the show. And in what I think is pretty genius, this emotion of our main characters is made stronger by the contrast with the absurd, uncaring world. They are our anchors in a universe that can seem on the brink of chaos and despair. But interestingly, the bottlers aren't the only ones who have this function as emotional anchors. So does Snicket. When I say emotional anchor, I don't mean that it's a character that displays emotions in an open and honest way. Justice Strauss, for example, genuinely loves the bottlers, and there's affection from several guardians towards the children, and there's affection also among the villains. What I mean by an emotional anchor is that it's a character whose role in the narrative is to react to emotional hardships. It's not exactly the same as a victim, but there is a sense that this character is where we should lay our sympathy and empathy. We should feel what they feel and care about what they care about, not only watch their daring hijinks and foiled schemes. And as Snicket's role is a completely passive one, as a narrator, despite being a character, his role is limited to the reaction to the events of the series. He emits judgment, he explains and he criticizes and he remembers better times and hopes for a better future. He talks a bunch, but he doesn't act. The children, by comparison, do try to be active and improve the situation, often by falling deeper into a web of mysteries and losses. They're forced to do so, to be inactive, to wait for an adult to help them, often proves to be basically waiting for a miracle, for something that is unlikely to happen, and if it does, it will prove to be too little, too late. And so, a series of unfortunate events presents Snicket and the bottlers as the only ones really conscious of what it is that matters most. Even the heroes of VFD are trapped, confused, and delayed by the villains, and are as much as caricatures of nobility and heroism as the hench people are caricatures of villainy. And that's kind of my issue with the Netflix series. Lemony Snicket ends up being that one good adult, the one who actually could have the competence to help the children. It's great and good to show the children having the autonomy to make their own decisions, but they're still children. Children who have grown a lot through trauma, constant danger and threat, and need to be ready to protect themselves and each other while on the lam, but they're still children, abandoned by the world and in need of support and a way to heal. They need to do so in order to be able to function and develop as people. In the series, their growth is almost stunted in a way. It is good for Snicket to respect their decisions, but when you take into account how Snicket himself was trained by BFD to believe that, beyond one clear moment of truth, children don't necessarily need support systems, and that family is the only thing you really can trust. I'm not saying Snicket should just have stuffed them inside of a taxi and drove them away from danger to somewhere that's safe, wherever that could be. But no matter how much they had to grow up in the span of maybe a year, less than a year, they shouldn't be forced to make these decisions. They are children, and that's the biggest flaw of the whole series in my opinion. It's wonderful in the way it tackles the emotions of the bottlers as they grow up, in the way it adapts the biggest conflict of the original novels. But it doesn't really tackle the actual effects of BFD, the all-encompassing authority in this fictional universe, how it indoctrinates and recruits children. I think that's really why at least I wanted to see an adaptation of the prequel series of books, All the Wrong Questions, because at least there the actual conflict of PFD agents and the organization itself is part of the main story. It doesn't depict life as a child agent as a cool, awesome thing. It shows the effects it has on the kids. It shows what it did to Lemony and to his siblings. It is but a footnote on the whole, a series of unfortunate events universe, but it reveals a lot, perhaps even more so than the original series, about the satirical, absurd world that feels so close to home. Lemony Snicket, by virtue of being our narrator, is the ultimate authority for us, the readers, the audience, on the Baudelaire children and their misadventures. And as such, it is very important, in my opinion, to keep in mind his own subjectivity and how his experiences in BFD tint his perspective. As a reader and as a watcher, one has to engage with the story of a series of unfortunate events as a piece where the narrator may not be completely trustworthy, and acknowledge his own opinions on the stories he tells and how that may sway your views in the narrative. Abuse is systemic, and while Olaf is a clear embodiment of that abuse, Mr. Poe, Justice Strauss, Monty, Josephine, Jerome, Hector, Nero, and really most of their tutors, even those who may not be tutors like the Dinawoman siblings and the Snicket siblings, all of them are in a certain way complicit. It is not only active punishment, aggression, and silencing, it's also in the inaction, in the lack of attention, in the lack of support and protection. And it is part of the theme of the series, both the books and the Netflix show, that through courage, teamwork, and smarts, these children can survive a world full of authorities hell-bent on either destroying them, taking advantage of them, or corrupting them. But at least I think so. Survival is imperative, but it shouldn't be a struggle. It should be a right, something nobody should have to fight for. Authorities of any sort should be able to protect those they rule over, just as parents, either biological, adoptive, or acting in loco parentis, are supposed to protect their children. No one should have to fight to become self-sufficient in order to be treated decently as a human being, even less children who have had to go through a series of unfortunate events. Well, that's all I could organize into a cohesive whole about the subject. Please, if you feel like it, tell me what your thoughts were on the portrayal of Snicket, and if you have any particular comments about the video in general, I'd love to know. I will be linking a few articles I read while writing this video down in the description for further reading if anyone's still interested. I would also like to add that there's a really good video tackling I would also like to add that there's a really good video tackling some of the adaptation changes between movie and show. Finally, I'd like to recommend this little written essay that I found that also talks about Snicket as a narrator, which I found quite interesting and easy to read. And if you're a big fan of the show, or even if you're just interested in the mysteries of the Snicketverse, there's this blog, Snicket Sleuth, that has almost all the theories and investigations done on the little clues left in the text of the original books. There's a link down there to the blog too. So, that's all from me now. Thanks for watching. In the manner of other children's there's no equivalent. There's no equivalent. There's no equivalent. There's no He doesn't take distance. He